I've always loved the outdoors and going on adventures, so when I was 12 and got a letter about scout camp, I brought it to my mom right away to have her sign, and handed it in the following week. I was small at that age, but was raised in the roughest street in my neighborhood, so I was pretty street smart. My older brother also did scouts back then. He was 15 and did a lot of drugs, so I was just looking forward to finally getting to know him more since he was usually out with his friends. I sat with him on the bus, and he told me we would be sharing a tent, so I was excited to spend some extra time with him. After we got off the bus and headed to the campsite, we set up our tents and did some icebreaker activities. I got to know the rest of the group and even made some friends. We were all tired from our journey, so we didn't do much that night, and the instructors told us to go to bed and get some rest. Once we got settled, my brother told me he was going to sneak out later that night with his friends to drink and smoke, and said I could come along, as long as I didn't snitch. I didn't want to look like a bum, so I agreed. Midnight rolled around, and we got ready to go out. I took a knife, some snacks, and a flashlight. We headed to a secluded area with his friends, but it felt a little off. I felt like I was being watched, but when I told my brother, he said to just ignore it. We walked a bit further and found a rundown cabin, and continued past it until we found a dip in the ground where we could start a fire. I was a little afraid of my brother's friends. They were big and looked like gym bros who took steroids, so I didn't say much. After we started our fire, they got out some beer, and my brother offered me some. I wanted to look cool and blend in, so I said yes. After talking for a while, they pulled out some papers and tobacco, and my brother took out a little plastic bag. When he opened it, I knew from the smell that it was weed. They started rolling some joints and passing them around. When the joint got to me, I thought, fuck it, and took a couple drags. Before I knew it, I was high, but I liked it. It felt relaxing and chilled me out. It was around 4 a.m. by then, so we decided to head back to our tents. On the way, we saw the cabin from earlier, but ignored it again. Something was off about it, but I couldn't put my finger on it. When we got back to our tents, I fell straight asleep. In the morning, our instructors put us into groups for the day. I was in the smallest group with Jack, who I had met the night before, and 2 other boys named Sam and Adam. We got along really well, and when it came time to choose partners, I chose Jack. We were talking about how we had a good time last night, and Jack let me know that he usually sneaks off like that at most camps. I asked him if he remembered the cabin, and he said yes. Then I asked if he felt like something was off about it, and he also said yes. That's when he asked our instructor if he had any stories about cabins in the woods around us, and he told us a horrifying story that really freaked me out. He said that one night, a group of scouts ventured into the woods and found a cabin. There was a foul odor around it, so they went in to explore. They ended up finding a body hanging from a ceiling fan and ran back to camp to tell the instructors to call the police. The police searched the woods, but couldn't find the cabin, so they left without discovering anything. The scouts couldn't believe that the cabin would just disappear like that, so they went out and ventured into the forest again. They found the cabin in the same spot, but this time it was smaller, and there was no smell. According to our instructor's story, after the Scouts left camp that summer, they all committed suicide. The cabin from the story has never been found since, but clearly that must just be a legend. At dinner, I sat with my brother and his friends, and we talked about going out again that night. We headed out around the same time, and once we had been walking for about 20 minutes, we found the cabin again. This time, we decided to explore it. The first thing we all noticed was a terrible smell, just like from our instructor's story. While we were searching, we found a small room with a closed door. When we opened the door, we saw a bloody knife on a table next to a bathtub that was full of water. Seeing that, we all agreed to leave immediately. As we walked off, I looked over my shoulder, and I swear I could see a head peering through one of the windows at us. I didn't want to look like a wimp, so I didn't say anything about it. Eventually, we arrived at the same spot we had spent the previous night and set a fire and drank some beer. My brother and his friends rolled some more joints. This time, they gave me an entire joint to smoke myself, and soon enough, I was high again. After a while, we decided to head back to our tents, but stopped by the cabin one more time on our way. We got to where we all remembered the cabin being, but it wasn't there. We tried to brush it off, thinking that we must have just taken a different route. When we all got back to our tents, I finally told my brother about what I saw through that cabin window, and his face went white. What if the person you saw killed someone in that cabin? That would explain the smell, and the bloody knife, my brother said, clearly scared by the thought. I remembered the feeling of being watched from the first night. What if the person in the cabin was waiting for me? What if he only left us alone because he wasn't expecting a group? My brother tried to calm us down and suggested we just get some sleep. When we woke up in the morning, I felt really sick, as did everyone else we were with the night before. We tried to brush it off as a coincidence, and luckily that was the day we were all going home anyway. This may not be very scary to hear now, but after listening to our instructor's story about the disappearing cabin and then having such a similar experience, it was one of the scariest things I've ever been through in my life. I'm 19 years old, and I've been a Boy Scout my whole life. My 19th birthday happened recently, so unfortunately, I can't be a scout anymore. I became an Eagle Scout when I was 17, which is relatively young. I've been in the same troop with some of my friends since we were 11. We went through the rankings together, and almost all of our childhood experiences have revolved around each other. We grew up in a rural area in New Jersey, so we've always loved the outdoors. Camping, hunting, and fishing were our favorites. A few weeks ago, my friend Luke asked me and my other friends Mark, Nick, and Owen if we wanted to go out on a hunting preserve in Pennsylvania. His uncle owned about 8 acres of woods with streams and lakes out there, and had invited us for a 4-day-long camping trip. Since we all loved that stuff, we excitedly agreed. We drove out on a Thursday night, and it took us about an hour to get to Luke's uncle's land. Once we got there, we went to the wooden cabin that Luke's uncle was letting us borrow. He unlocked it, and I have to say, it was pretty nice. It had a working toilet, a stove, lighting, and some other goodies. It wasn't the full outdoor camping experience we were used to, but it was close enough. We had brought a cooler with some drinks, and we're all set to start our weekend. It was just like it used to be when we were kids, sitting around a fire and talking all night. Around 12:30, we went to bed. The next morning, Luke woke us up around 6 a.m. to go fishing at the lake. We grabbed our gear and headed out. It was cold that morning, but beautiful. The sun was beginning to rise, and the sky was turning blue. It only took us about 5 minutes of walking to get to the lake. We spread out a bit to enjoy some peaceful fishing, but I stuck with Nick and hung out on the grass. I picked up my rod and went out for a few casts. Everyone else was about 15 yards apart from each other. The lake was pretty huge, so you could barely see the other side. While I was casting, I heard Nick mutter, "What the fuck?" from behind me, so I turned around and asked him what was up. He pointed diagonally across the lake at a faint figure standing across from us. They looked tall, but I couldn't really make out anything else. I looked back at Nick and saw the concern on his face, so I called for Luke, Mark, and Owen to join us. We showed them what we were looking at, and the figure just kept standing there, totally still. We felt pretty uneasy, so we slowly walked away and headed back to the cabin. We mostly forgot about it by that afternoon, playing cards and listening to music all day. It was about 1:30 by then, and we were getting hungry for lunch. We went out back to the little charcoal grill, and Owen, being the best cook of the group, fired it up and put on some burgers. The rest of us were just joking around and hanging out while Owen cooked, when suddenly we heard some crunching leaves from the woods surrounding the cabin. We stopped talking and looked over at the tree line. About 10 yards away, we saw a person who was trying to hide behind a tree. Just like the figure I had noticed across the lake before, he was tall, very tall, probably about 6'8". We were scared shitless, and we lost it when we saw the person's head turn around from behind the tree. It was pale and had black, messy hair. He had on a solemn expression, and he looked like a mental patient. He was wearing very baggy and worn clothes. Luke ran back to the cabin, grabbed his uncle's hunting rifle, and fired a shot in the air. He yelled, "Get the hell out now!" We heard leaves crunching as the person ran away. We all wanted to get the hell out of there after that. Luke wanted us to give the trip just one more chance, but we told him he was being crazy. He was pretty much begging though, so being good friends, we said yes. After lunch, we went into the woods to enjoy some nature and do some hunting. We figured it'd be good to get a break from the cabin. After about 2 hours, we headed back. When we arrived, the cabin door was wide open. Luke stuttered and said, "You guys saw me lock it, right?" We all said yes, remembering that he had made such a big deal about locking up before we went hunting to make sure we'd be safe. Luckily, we were still armed, so we raised our weapons and walked in slowly. Inside, the place was completely ransacked. Most of the food and beer was gone, and a few personal items were missing too. And there was a note on Luke's bed. It only had 4 words on it: Luke's full name and his uncle's full name. That was it. Without even discussing it, we grabbed our shit and hopped back in the car and drove the fuck out of there. The most off-putting part was trying to imagine how this person knew both Luke's name and his uncle's. They ended up getting the locks changed and contacted the police to investigate the cabin for fingerprints or other evidence about who could have broken in. I haven't heard any other updates from Luke, but I'm constantly afraid that the intruder may have known who the rest of us were as well. When I was little, my parents and I lived in a small neighborhood, mostly full of old couples and immigrants, outside of a big city. There were a couple reported sex offenders in the neighborhood, but my parents were never really concerned. They were both old and wheelchair-bound. I was young, and if it came down to it, I could easily outrun them. Plus, both of their homes had steps out front, and they were both too frail to attempt to get down them. Overall, we felt pretty safe at home. I was a Girl Scout back then, and would go house to house selling a decent amount of cookies and magazine subscriptions to my neighbors. I was about 6 at the time and loved riding my bike, so I made my rounds pretty quickly to get to every house. There I was, all dressed up in my jean skirt and little brownie vest, getting people to sign orders for their cookies, when I rode up to one of the pedophiles' homes. Since my mom was right behind me on her bike, she said it was okay for me to go ahead and knock, and a kind old lady in a yellow dress answered the door. I sold her about 20 boxes of cookies, so I was glad I had stopped. I recognized her as the man's sister, with her gray, curly hair, overdone makeup, and those red librarian glasses that have a pearl string to hold them like a necklace. Nothing seemed strange about the interaction, and she waved goodbye as I rode my bike back to my mom to head home for dinner. That night was like any other normal Tuesday night. After dinner, I watched Nova and went to bed around 8. What wasn't normal was that around 9, I heard footsteps outside my window, stopping right by the bushes. I thought it might be my dad, so I peeked out under the shade and saw a man that definitely wasn't my dad trying to peek through. He had wrinkles all over his face and was wearing gloves. I quickly crawled back to bed, staying quiet and listening as his footsteps stomped to my other window, and then finally away from the house. I told my parents what happened the next day, and my dad immediately shot up and ran to the door, walking around the house to where my bedroom windows are. He came back looking disgusted and pulled my mom aside to talk to her in private. They ended up calling the police, who came to our home before talking to the 2 pedophiles in the neighborhood. I'm in my 20s now, so when I brought this up to my mom again recently, she told me some details that I was too young to hear back then. She said that my dad found dried semen under my windowsill, by the fence in the backyard, and on the wall beneath the bathroom window. Apparently, one of the men who was wheelchair-bound was actually able to walk and had been using his sister's wheelchair to put on a ruse. His sister had died a few years earlier, and he would wear her clothes and makeup to answer the door so he could talk to the neighborhood children. It still creeps me out to this day that I had no idea I had been talking to a predator for years. Many years ago, when I was around 13, I was very active in the Boy Scouts. One August weekend, my troop had traveled to a state park in rural West Virginia. That trip was the first time that most of us were going spelunking, including the adults. There was a healthy mix of anxiety and excitement in each of us, as we weren't really sure what to expect. We arrived Friday evening and set up camp before the last light of day disappeared. For dinner, we quickly boiled hot dogs, scarfing them down so we could go fishing as the water cooled for the night. There was a little lake right within view of our campground. We stayed there for a few hours, trying out a variety of lures and methods, but to no avail. When it got to be around 11:30, my best friend at the time, Seth, and I decided that we would just get up early to try fishing again. The troop was going to get in a car the next day to travel to Ohio for caving, but if we got up early enough, we would have more time to catch some trout. Not only that, but neither of us had our trout license, so we had to sneak out early so none of the adults could stop us. At 3 a.m., my watch alarm beeped, waking me up. I didn't care that I had only slept about 3 hours. I felt invigorated. I woke Seth up, and we silently gathered our fishing equipment, slipped on our boots, and made the trek out to the lake. The night was clear and cool, and the full moon provided enough light so we didn't need the flashlights. Instead of following a trail, we just walked towards the lake, following the conjoining creek upstream, in hopes of finding a shallower area where the trout would be stuck in their travels. We followed the creek past a fence that noted we were entering private property. We were just kids, though, and had little reason to care. We continued walking in silence, about 3 miles overall. As we walked, the trees and bushes around us thickened. We expected as much, since we had seen a map of the area and there were no roads or trails out there. We were completely immersed in nature, or so we thought until we ran into a cabin out in the woods. The cabin was relatively small, only about 12 by 12 feet, and it was made out of pale cinder block. I would have assumed it was just a storage facility of some kind if it wasn't for one major detail that stuck out. On the side facing us, there was a window. Through the frosted glass, the pale blue light of a television glared. We still hadn't reached the fishing spot we were looking for, so I leaned over and whispered to Seth that the person inside must have fallen asleep watching TV. I mean, that was the most logical conclusion, right? I know it's common for rural people to get up early, but 4 a.m. seemed way too early. We stepped lightly beside the hut, trying to pass it, but I stopped dead in my tracks when Seth's arm jutted across my chest, signaling for me to keep still. The person in the hut was standing in the window, staring right at us. We couldn't make out his face through the frosted glass, but we didn't need to. It was clear they were looking directly at us. We refused to move, since the chances they could actually see us in the morning light were pretty low. Hopefully they would just shrug it off and assume they heard an animal walking by, and would just go back to watching TV and probably sipping on their beer. But he never sat down. He definitely must have seen us. About 10 feet away, this man was staring at 2 kids through the window. Panicked thoughts began to race through our minds. What would he do to us? Why was he up at 4 a.m. to begin with? Was he even the owner of the hut, or was he just hiding out since there were no roads around? The answer to these questions didn't matter. All that mattered was the fact that this strange man was continuing to stare at us, 2 frozen 13-year-olds alone in the woods. I started to hear a thud, and I assumed it was from the television. The thud started to get louder and louder until my vision started to blur with each repeated sound. Finally, I realized it was the sound of my heart beating. I did my best to remain still. I shut my eyes and focused all of my effort on remaining perfectly statue-like. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth. This went on for about 10 or 15 minutes. until I breathed out my nose and felt the sudden urge to sneeze. I pressed my tongue against the roof of my mouth, hoping to suppress it, but I couldn't stop. I sneezed. The guy in the window sneezed too. That's when we finally realized it wasn't a window. It was a sign on the side of the building. That wasn't a TV. It was the reflection of the light of the moon. That wasn't someone staring at us. It was my own silhouette reflecting in the sign. This was probably the most petrified I've been in my whole life, but it turns out I was just afraid of my own shadow.